the Clery Act, common mistakes and how to avoid them. Featuring Jim Moore, Senior Advisor, Clery Act Compliance and Campus Safety Operations, Clery Group.
Hello and welcome to this session on the Clery Act, common mistakes and how to avoid them. My name is Jim Moore. I'm the Senior Advisor for Clery Act Compliance and Campus Safety Operations at the U.S. Department of Education, and it is my pleasure to be able to share this important information with you today. We just want to start with a disclaimer. Because we're talking about the Clery Act and campus safety issues, it is necessary for us to discuss issues around violent crime and related topics, and that can be disturbing for some people. So we always want you to first and foremost take care of yourself during these sessions. It is also important to remember that to have a useful conversation today, we have to deal with a lot of complex issues in general terms. So if you ever need help with a specific compliance issue that arises at your institution, please feel free to come to the department and we would always try to help you. And we also want to ask that we keep this information as it's intended to be for instructional and illustrative purposes. It is not really intended for attribution or publication beyond the use for this conference. Now, as we talk about the Clery Act, for those of you who may be new to the Title IV programs, we're talking about the campus safety, crime prevention, and consumer protection provisions of Title IV. These rules came into effect in 1990, and they are really the result of the work of one family, and that is the Clery family of Pennsylvania. This is the memorial that sits on the campus of Lehigh University, where Jean Clery was unfortunately killed in April of 1986. And that important monument, which means so much to those of us in the campus safety area, says on it, "Lest we forget the meaning of her death, that we must protect one another so that her life will not have been in vain." It is really one of the controlling messages for those of us who do this work. And it means so very much to us what Jean has meant to us and what her family's work has meant to the area of campus safety and crime prevention around the country. But we know that this could stand in for any student. There's nothing special about colleges and universities and other schools that in any way suggests that they will be crime-free. And so we do this work in the name of Jean and the others that we have lost over the years in the hopes that we will not lose anymore. Let's talk about the Clery Act today. The Clery Act is a substantive campus safety requirement. It is not a paperwork requirement. So we urge you to always think first about the people, not just the paper. We're very focused these days in the Clery space on student wellness. Congress is working on anti-hazing legislation. There's a lot of discussion about suicide prevention and overall mental health in the higher education space, and these are all areas that we should be focused on in addition to our regulatory requirements under the Clery Act, because the Clery Act's history is one of expansion. Congress has expanded the Clery Act on a number of occasions to deal with safety problems on America's campuses, and they continue to focus on that work. And so we actually want to try to stay ahead of the curve, not merely doing what the law requires, but doing what our students and employees need from us in the safety space. We would always encourage you to take a problem-solving approach to campus safety issues. We never want to just turn away from these issues and pretend that they don't exist. And we also need to think about risk mitigation. We will never have risk elimination. There's no such thing as an inherently safe space. But there are things that we can do on all campuses to make them safer and to improve transparency along the way. We always want to make sure that we're training our people about campus safety and wellness issues. All of our stakeholder groups, that's our students, that's certainly our employees, especially our public safety professionals if we have them. And then making sure that we have the right kinds of partnerships. That's partnerships across offices within the institution, but also with the local community. And again, all of this is in furtherance of building a culture of transparency. It's when transparency breaks down that we end up with serious problems in the campus safety space. We're going to talk a little bit about Clery geography today, as well as in addition to the importance of records. Now, those of you who work in the Title IV space, you know that records are extremely important in the financial aid programs. They are also very important, vitally important in the campus safety space. We have to make sure we're creating and preserving the right records, that we're very careful about making sure that we do not destroy records that must be retained for a period of time. And of course, we never want to fabricate records. Unfortunately, sometimes well-meaning people will fabricate records just to try to show that they're in compliance. This is never a good idea in any aspect of your institutional operation, and we certainly discourage it in the safety space. If there is a situation where you are asked for documents by the U.S. Department of Education or some other law enforcement or oversight agency and you simply don't have them, or you failed to comply with a requirement and therefore never created the record in the first place, always better to just be very transparent and upfront about that fact. We want to make sure that we're annually distributing these required reports, the annual security report, which we will talk a lot about, the annual fire safety report, and the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act reporting known as the DAP. We want to make sure that we are taking steps to ensure that nobody at our institutions, students, employees, or others, are ever retaliated against for trying to make sure that the Clery Act, Title IX, or any of these other campus safety and crime prevention rules are enforced. Students have a right to come forward with safety concerns, as do employees, and we should honor those. We should at least take an accounting of them. It's possible that management may disagree, and disagreeing with the student or employee is obviously not retaliation in and of itself. But if there's any kind of lashing out at the person, any kind of intimidation, coercion, or discrimination, there could be a finding that the school has retaliated against the individual, and there can be very serious consequences for that. We also want you to know that we will be issuing new guidance in the Clery space hopefully in the next few months. We want to make sure that that is done in a way that is complementary to other things that's happening in the space, and we will continue to support a number of training efforts along the way to make sure that everybody understands the requirements of the law and has the assistance they need to comply. You're seeing increased agency cooperation. This has actually been a focal point for the Biden administration. What does that mean? Well, we've always worked closely with other offices in the Department of Education, as well as agencies like the Justice Department and the Department of Health and Human Services. But now we're looking beyond that. And in one case, we actually got a referral from, of all places, NASA, which makes grants to higher education institutions, and in their oversight of that grant became concerned about some campus safety issues at a particular institution and recommended that we take a look. That's how much interagency cooperation there is today. We want to look for those intersections with the VAWA, the so-called Violence Against Women Act provisions of Clery, and the Title IX requirements. We know that Title IX is about sexual discrimination, which includes sexual harassment and sexual violence. Many of you know that our colleagues in the Office for Civil Rights are currently working on new regulations in that space. It's going to be very important to understand how those regulations affect your institution as soon as they come online, and to make sure that you implement them in a way that complements your VAWA programming, which probably hasn't changed very much since those rules went into place in 2015. If you are hearing about VAWA for the first time in the context of Clery Act compliance, there's an issue there, and we got to get on top of it right away. As I said, we're both doing more enforcement and more assistance. Assistance includes training like this event today, and the kind of ongoing technical assistance that we provide to schools. We want to make sure in all areas of our Title IV work that we understand our legal requirements and best practice. Legal requirements is what we might think of as the compliance floor. It's the minimum that we have to do. At the end of the day, that's all we really need. is to make sure that we've complied, but we would always encourage you to work in furtherance of best practice. And then in the campus safety space, especially if we have law enforcement officers or public safety officers of any kind on our campus, we want to make sure that they're getting the kind of training that will allow them to treat everybody fairly and to make sure that they are taking into account the diversity and well-being of all of our students and employees. A very important kind of training for public safety officials is implicit bias training. Sometimes officers don't even realize that they're acting out of bias. We want to de-escalate wherever possible. We want to make sure we're using force in a way that is consistent with the law and our institutional values and principles. Now let's talk about campus safety as students understand it. Sometimes we hear that from some schools that they don't think students care very much about campus safety. I can tell you that is simply not true. These are findings that were made in a very large, one of the largest of its kind, campus safety survey. It was conducted by the Clery Center for Security on Campus, the organization founded by the Clery family, and ADT Security. And what they found was that 82% of students said that they're very concerned about campus safety issues as they return to school in the fall of 2021. By the way, they're going to do this survey again, and the early indications are from other work we've done that the numbers actually are going to go up. Students are increasingly concerned about safety issues of all kinds. And 97% of the students in this survey said that they consider their own personal safety while they're on campus and as they're moving around and conducting their lives. Now, what we all know is that students as a group, especially students of typical college age, and we have students all across the spectrum, right? And we don't want to generalize too much. But what we know about the neuroscience of college age students in general is that they ascertain risk slightly differently than other people. So sometimes by their actions, we might think that they don't necessarily care as much about personal safety issues. That's just not true. It's about how they process their concern and how it affects their behavior. These are criminological points that we talk about all the time in the campus safety space. 70% of those students reported talking to family members and close friends about ways to stay safe on campus. And 74% of students reported that they, in the first instance, trust their schools to provide a supportive environment. As you might imagine, in our enforcement work, we spend a lot of time with the other 26%. So 74 are pretty sure that their schools are trying to do the best job they can, and then we deal with the rest. We don't really want you to fall into that 26% if at all possible. One of the ways you can avoid that is making sure that your school is administratively capable. Now, many of you in the Title IV space understand the concept of administrative capability. We talk about it all the time in the Title IV programs. And you might think, how does this apply to the Clery Act? It applies in very much the same way as it applies to everything else we do here at the Department of Education under Title IV. We have to have an adequate number of qualified persons. That's a regulatory quote. We need to make sure that we're operating the programs with appropriate checks and balances in a system of internal controls, that we have written procedures, and that we can produce information to the secretary upon request, right? So what might this look like in the Clery space? Well, even if we're a very small school, we have to have somebody to whom people can report safety concerns. There are many schools in the Title IV programs that may only have 3 or 5 or 10 employees. Other schools might have thousands of employees, and we'll talk a little bit about how that might show up in terms of who is a campus security authority under the Clery Act. But we have to have somebody at the school who understands these requirements and can implement them. So you should be asking yourself at various points throughout the year, and the end of a calendar year is a good time to consider and ask the question, are we meeting our marks for administrative capability, including with regard to the Clery Act? Very often at schools, certain schools anyway, Clery considerations don't come to the fore until a problem presents, right? This is especially true for some of our smaller career schools where perhaps everybody goes home at night. There's no housing, there's no big athletic program. You might think the Clery Act really isn't about me. It's about those big traditional schools. That is simply not true, again, because crime can occur anywhere. Let's understand the basic requirements of the Clery Act. There are several of them, but they can be grouped together in ways that maybe add some simplicity as we move along here. All institutions that have a physical presence and receive Title IV funds have to comply with the Clery Act. What do we mean physical presence? Well, if we have a school that is truly 100% online, or we are operating a school that is a foreign institution of higher education, they don't have to comply with the Clery Act. But if you're a domestic school, you have a physical presence, and you actually receive Title IV funds, you have to comply with the Clery Act, full stop. The most foundational requirement of the Clery Act is to produce something called an annual security report. It is what it sounds like. It is a report that both includes all of your campus crime statistics and your campus safety and crime prevention policy information. Institutions also have to distribute those reports to all students and employees. They also must submit their crime statistics to the department on an annual basis through something called the Data Collection and Survey. Schools must have a way to issue timely warnings and emergency notifications. These are basically safety alerts. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Schools that have some kind of a public safety presence must maintain a daily crime log. All schools need to have an emergency evacuation and response program. Now, it may be very simple for some schools, right? We have everything. That's one of the beautiful things about the Title IV programs is the diversity of the schools that participate. We have the equivalent of a one-room schoolhouse all the way up to a school that looks like a city and everything in between. Every school needs an emergency evacuation and response program, but what yours looks like might be very different from the school nearest you. We got to make sure that our policies and procedures meet the regulatory requirements, but most importantly is that they will work for our campus. Schools that have housing also have requirements to have missing student notification provisions, and they also have to comply with certain fire safety requirements. We break out the Violence Against Women Act requirements because they are so important, and your compliance with these is essential to your compliance with Title IX of the civil rights requirements and aspects of Title VI of the civil rights requirements as well. All of these things tend to be connected in important ways. VAWA required expanded reporting for certain kinds of sexual violence, specifically dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking to complement the sexual assault requirements that were already in the law for rape, fondling, statutory rape, and incest. And then it required schools to engage in much more programming on sexual assault prevention and response, ongoing programming that will make sure that our students understand our code of conduct, our requirements for their behavior, consequences for violating any kind of a sexual misconduct policy. And we also have expanded requirements for providing accommodations and protective measures to our students and employees who have unfortunately experienced sexual violence of some kind. Now we talk about the top 5 problems. So we've highlighted some of the requirements. It won't be a surprise to you that some violations occur more often than others. And they are violations relating to those annual security reports. Misclassification and underreporting of crimes, failures to issue timely warnings and emergency notifications in the required manner, failures to identify and notify our campus security authorities. You'll hear me refer to those as CSAs, a very important concept. Every school in our programs that has to comply with the Clery Act has at least one CSA. Some schools will have thousands of them. And then this concept of Clery geography. Where does our campus start and stop for campus safety purposes? Now, part of understanding our requirements under the annual security report, production and distribution provisions, is to understand what has to be in that report. Now, one of the first things I can tell you is that a report has to have a front cover, a back cover, and all the required content in between. What you don't want to have is what some people refer to as a web link farm, right? There are schools that if you clicked on 47 different links on their website, you might be able to assemble all the information that has to be in the annual security report. You also don't need to hire anybody to consolidate this information for you. You can do it yourself. You could assemble it all under one document, make it a comprehensive document, front cover, back cover, all the required content in between, and you'll have a report so long as you've met the various requirements. Now, we're not going to highlight every policy requirement, but we wanted to point out a few. You need to tell people how you've gone about assembling your crime statistics. You have to tell people how to report, right? That might seem like an obvious thing for folks, but think about the new student to your school, the new employee who might not understand your policies and procedures. Some people may not want to walk into a police station. They might be more comfortable coming to HR if they're an employee, or the student conduct office, or somebody in residence life, or perhaps a coach, right? Not everybody's going to walk into the police department. We need to be aware of that. There's lots of reasons why that might be the case at your school. And we need to talk about how we're going to issue warnings and how we are going to go about the process of effectuating emergency management. Who are our key CSAs? And then we have to talk about issues that might not seem obvious, but if we go back to the beginning of the law and we think about the crime that culminated in the death of Jean Clery and sadly so many others on campuses, are issues like building access control. The crime that culminated in the death of Jean Clery began as a burglary in a residence hall. It proceeded to an act of sexual violence and ended in her death. And then we want to talk about the enforcement authority of whatever public safety officials we have on our campus. You could imagine a situation of a very small school that has one contract security guard who simply works at night, making sure that folks can get safely to their car, for example. Very common at some of our career schools, all the way up to universities that have a full police department with dozens or maybe even 100 officers with various kinds of specialties. We have schools in the program that have their own SWAT teams, their own anti-terrorism divisions, right? Gang units, drug task force officials, and so on and so on. We don't tell you what kind of safety program you have to have. We say you have to be transparent with your community about the public safety program that's in place. Let's talk about a few other things. We need to talk about our relationship with state and local law enforcement. We need to talk about our own training programs. We mentioned missing students, very important. What about our rules and regulations that might govern the conduct of students and employees off campus? Most schools have policies in place that might be able to hold students or employees accountable under codes of conduct, even when they're not on campus. A lot of times students are very surprised to find out that's the case. What about our drug and alcohol policies? What possible sanctions might pertain if students violate those policies? What about treatment programs? What about re-entry opportunities for folks who might be separated for a period of time? We talked about sexual assault prevention and response, but also investigation and adjudication of claims. Remember, under Title IX and the Clery Act, some students may opt to go through a campus process rather than going through the criminal justice system to seek redress for sexual violence. And then we talk about what are we going to do to help those who have had sexual violence impact their lives in some ways. One of the ways that's required under the Clery Act is to provide something called the Survivor's Brochure. This is a special document that includes information about the survivor's rights and options. Rights and options for what? Well, to report the offense, for one, and to understand what will happen if they go forward with a complaint, to understand what might be able to be done for them in terms of accommodations, protective measures, and support services, and to try to give them an opportunity to continue with their education if they want to. Now, the next most common violation is where school either underreports its crime statistics or misclassifies the incidents, which could also cause them to be underreported. A couple principles here that come to us from the world of criminology that we just have to understand. Again, there's no such thing as an inherently safe place. Crime is everywhere and crime moves. Sadly, in my line, one of the things that I hear from schools a lot, especially college presidents, who tend to be very positive people as a category, they say the same thing so often that it actually is upsetting to hear the refrain, which is they say, we didn't think this could happen here. Unfortunately, it can happen anywhere. We see this in the news all the time with active shooter situations, with other kinds of criminal acts that impact innocent people every day in this country and around the world. So we have to understand that there's nothing about our campus or our community that makes us inherently safe, and so we have to be on alert. The Clery Act covers 4 basic categories of crimes. So-called criminal offenses is the first one. This is the one they make all the TV shows about. Starts with murder, goes all the way through to arson, includes in the middle things like sex crimes, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, motor vehicle theft. They're the kinds of crimes that get covered on the news all the time. Then there's hate crimes. These are crimes that manifest some evidence that the victim of the offense was targeted for their actual or perceived membership in a group or category. Here we think about race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, and so on, right? Our VAWA offenses we mentioned already, dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking, which includes cyber stalking. These days, one does not need to approach a person directly to commit an act of stalking. We can do that by electronic means. Interestingly enough, under hate crimes, the same thing happens with the crime of intimidation. If you do that by electronic means, it is no less traumatic very often for the victim. They still ascertain these things as a threat to their very life and the security of their property and the wellness and safety of their family and friends. So we have to think about electronic crimes that have some connectivity to the campus. And then we have arrests and disciplinary referrals for liquor law, drug law, and weapons law offenses. Now, the most important thing that you can take away from this discussion, and one of the reasons why there are so many violations in this space, is that people do not understand what a reported crime is for Clery Act purposes. That 4th bullet, very important. A crime is reported for Clery Act purposes anytime that incident is brought to the attention of a campus security authority or local law enforcement. Full stop. Many schools and police organizations will have multiple steps that are required to report a crime. If we're thinking about sexual violence, for example, very often the person will have to come in for a second interview. They will have to produce their clothing or other materials for forensic testing. They will have to have a list of witnesses, maybe produce other evidence like cell phone data or text messages, if they were having some kind of ongoing communication with the perpetrator or perpetrators. None of that is required under the Clery Act. If this student comes to a campus security authority and reports this incident as having occurred on the school's Clery geography, it is reported and must be included in the statistics unless that incident can be unfounded by law enforcement. And to unfound a crime, the standard is very high. It means that the existing evidence suggests that the report is false or baseless. It doesn't mean that there's not just enough evidence to move forward with a prosecution. That is not enough to unfound a case. It's very often that a prosecutor might decide we don't have enough information to prosecute. Here we're saying the available information and evidence actually suggests that the report is false or baseless. Very high standard. And we need to make sure that for all schools, even schools that don't have any campus safety presence at all on the campus, again, they're going to have at least one CSA, and they do have to request crime statistics from local law enforcement agencies. Every school has to do that for their so-called Clery geography. Now, that might be one office in a corporate center somewhere. It might be a location in a shopping center. It might be literally the one-room schoolhouse example, all the way up to a mega state university. The third area that we mentioned as experiencing a large number of violations is this whole area of safety alerts. Again, one of the most important principles of the Clery Act is we need to be transparent, and often to be transparent in a way that makes a difference is we got to be quick. Okay? We cannot delay getting information to our students and employees that they need to make informed decisions about how to respond to certain kinds of incidents. And sometimes we don't want them to make any decision at all other than to shelter in place or not come anywhere near the campus in the first place. So again, under the Clery Act, we have two kinds of alerts. The first one has been in the law since the beginning, timely warnings. Here we're talking about these Clery reportable crimes. We just talked about what they are, right? They're crimes like murder, arson, but also hate crimes that might pose some kind of significant or ongoing threat, as well as those VAWA offenses. Sometimes people think of VAWA offenses and hate crimes as only posing an immediate or ongoing threat to a targeted victim. Well, obviously, there could be other people who are in the foreseeable zone of danger of those criminal behaviors, and we need to make an evaluation as to whether or not there is a need to warn, right? If it's an extremely close call, we would always recommend that you issue the warning. And if you cause a little bit of extra panic unnecessarily, we apologize to the community later, and maybe we refine our process. But I would always encourage you to over-report rather than under-report in an important area like this. Again, timely warnings must be issued to the entire area of your Clery geography, all of the students and employees found therein, when we have one of these crimes that may pose a significant or ongoing threat, because the whole point of timely warnings is to issue them in a way that is likely to prevent similar crimes from occurring. Emergency notifications are a little bit different. They have to be issued anytime we confirm an emergency or dangerous condition that may pose an immediate threat to student or employee health or safety on the campus. So it could be a wider array of potential threats, but a smaller geographical scope application, right? Because here we're only talking about the campus, remembering that Clery geography includes a range of other properties, including adjacent public property, accessible public property, and any patrol jurisdiction for our public safety officers, a much wider, potentially much wider geographical scope. Here, the scope is smaller on the campus, but for a wider range of threats, not just Clery reportable crimes, but it could be a credible bomb threat, which unfortunately have been experienced by many of our schools in the last couple of years, or a major weather event, an escaped prisoner who we believe is on our campus. That person may specifically be trying to not commit additional crimes because they're being pursued by law enforcement. They're trying to be surreptitious, but the fact that they're there obviously poses a threat to our people. Their health and safety is in danger when somebody like that is loose. So we need to be very much aware that warnings have to be issued. And I would say there should be a third category. It's not required by the law, but I would consider issuing other kinds of safety alerts if we think there's a good enough reason to, even if they don't fit into these two categories. And I'd always be able to say which ones are which. I would actually label that third category in my documentation and maybe in the message itself, such as to say, this is not required by the Clery Act, but we're letting you know that there's an issue that we think could affect your safety, and we want you to know about it. You could think about traffic issues. You could think about certain kinds of larceny crimes. Maybe there's been a rash of bicycle thefts or scooter thefts on your campus. Those aren't Clery reportable crimes. They probably don't create a dangerous situation per se, but it's the kind of information we may want our students and employees to have so that they can act in accordance with the level of risk. College students these days will very often report to us that they left their $5,000 computer or their very expensive bicycle, at the library while they went for a smoke break or to visit with their friends and somehow never thought that anybody might steal it, right? Well, reminding students actually helps. There's data on this, that if we reinforce the need to not only protect themselves but their property, they will behave in ways that actually help make the campus safer. We had a rule that was in place at the department during COVID that allowed schools to meet the emergency notification requirement by posting information on a website in banner form. That is no longer in place. It was effectively rescinded with the end of the national health emergency. We don't want you to rely on those banners anymore. That was based on a concept that there was a time when most schools had very few people in person on campus. Now, some schools, even at the height of the pandemic, had hundreds or potentially thousands of people who were still there, including students who couldn't get out, especially our international students at some schools. So the populations on campuses were much higher than the general public ever believed them to be. But even some small schools had to have people on campus regularly just to facilitate online learning, for example. Or schools that have livestock, and we have a lot of them, that have animals living on the campus. They had to be fed. They had to be cared for. And so people were there all the time. Public safety officials didn't stop coming to work. They still patrolled campuses, and safety issues can impact our public safety officials. So we want to make sure we understand this idea of safety alert. Now, campus security authorities, you've heard me mention already that there are several categories of them, and some schools forget to think about these categories that might not be obvious. The obvious category is our public safety officials. Again, that could be one contract security guard. It could be a full police department that is part of our institution. Right? That's easy. What's a little harder? Well, we have a lot of people that have safety-related functions that are not part of a public safety office. What does that mean? Think about here the employee who works the arm at the parking garage. They are deciding who gets in the parking garage and who doesn't. They're checking IDs. They're making sure you have the right kind of pass. That's a safety-related function. If somebody reports a crime to that person, they need to know what to do with that information. A category that came up during the pandemic is one that a lot of people hadn't thought of before. You might recall that a lot of schools had folks standing literally at the schoolhouse gate checking temperatures and giving people little quizzes about whether or not they felt ill, whether they've traveled, whether a family member has been exposed to COVID knowingly, and deciding who got on the campus. That's a safety-related function, and that made those people, at least for the time they were doing that work, campus security authorities. We think about what we sometimes call residence hall desk receptionists. Very commonly, residence life offices have folks who sit in the lobby of residence halls in the evening. They check IDs. They make sure that noise and visitation policies are followed. Those people are engaged in a safety-related function. And then we have our big catch-all category. Institutional officials with significant responsibility for student and campus activities. As you might guess, this is the big catch-all category. This could be everybody from a college president to a resident assistant in a residence hall. Everyone in between, but typically not faculty, and not folks who have more either clerical or sometimes environmental responsibilities. Here we might think about our janitors and maintenance folks. We usually would not include them as campus security authorities. Most instructors are not campus security authorities, but a lot of other people are. Significant responsibilities for student and campus activities. And then anybody who is so designated by their school as a campus security authority. Here again, we might think of a school that has no public safety function at all, and they're not required to as long as they're honest and upfront about that fact. You still have to have one campus security authority. At some of our small career schools, this might be the school director or the assistant school director or the assistant to somebody. And it's put out that if something happens here, either call 911 or report it to this school official, or both. Okay. Now, we can think about who some of these campus security officials are with a little more granularity. Again, campus leadership and administrators. A lot of deans don't think that they're campus security authorities. A lot of them are. A lot of VPs think the same thing. A lot of them are. Coaches, athletic directors, almost anybody involved in residence life. Folks who coordinate programs like study abroad or foreign campus administration. Student life and student organization staff, including student leaders, in most cases are going to be campus security authorities, and then all the folks involved in Title IX. A lot of people didn't used to realize that those people were campus security authorities. Now it's pretty well understood by most people in the profession, but occasionally it slides through. Now here I would encourage you to do a little knowledge check. You don't have to do it right now, but I'd make a note to follow up with folks at your school in these areas. Ask the question, how many CSAs do we think we have? Here's a metric. It is not a hard and fast rule. But a good metric seems to be that about 20% of a school's employees, broadly construed, will be CSAs. Now, you can find schools that are entirely compliant and it's under 10%. You can find schools where it's 35%. I'm saying as an average, as a metric, we find that at a lot of schools, it's about 20%. Then ask the question, have we notified people of their reporting obligations? You might have identified the CSAs. Now the next question is, do they know that they're CSAs and do they know what you expect them to do? What documentation do you keep to show that you've gone through a process to identify and notify your CSAs and given them some simplified way to report? We are not asking CSAs to become junior police officers or investigators. They are people who are designated to receive information, and then they get that information to people who can use it to keep students safe and to make sure that they can vindicate their rights. And then we ask the question, do our CSAs receive any training? Now, technically under the law, you are not required to train your CSAs. And I would suggest to you that if you don't, you have very little chance of complying. Here I think of the Title IV financial aid requirement, or lack of a requirement, is probably the way we should say it. There's nothing in Title IV that requires schools to have student-level account statements. This always seems amazing to people who are new to the profession. I've trained many of them, and they're always surprised, right? There's actually no requirement to have a student-level account statement. And if you don't, it's going to be very hard to recognize credit balances, to recognize who owes money, or to whom you owe funds, such as credit balances. So I think of it as almost a derivative requirement, if you don't mind me using that term. It is important that school officials who fall under the CSA designation have some information about those reporting obligations. Now let's talk about Clery geography. Generally speaking, with Clery geography, we are talking about buildings and properties that a school owns or controls for educational purposes. That's the simple way to think about it. So let's think about a career school. Here it's ABC Beauty School, and they exist in a shopping center, small. We see these all over the country, right? You've driven by these things and seen school names and not even known, what is that? What are they teaching in there? You might work at one, you might own one. You need to understand where your campus starts and stops, just like the more traditional school. Now, does ABC have to report for crime that occurs anywhere in the shopping plaza? Of course not. That would be massively over-reporting crime. You can imagine in these commercial establishments here. We have doctors' offices and pizza parlors and all kinds of other things on sale here. Jewelry store, there's a target, right? Do we report all of the crime that happens in the shopping center? No. What do we report for? The buildings and properties, the spaces that we own or control. Do we own these properties? No, but we control them under a leasehold. And we would also need to include any other property that is part of our school operation. So on the upper side of this schematic, we see the actual classroom space, ABC Beauty School. In the lower half, we see the clinic space. Anybody who's ever been in a beauty school knows that there's classroom space and administrative offices, and then there's typically a clinical site where people actually get to cut real people's hair. It's always fun to be there on the first day that students cut hair of live customers. Fascinating to watch. I've had the chance to do it a few times. But we're going to count those two things. Now, you might see on the bottom level of the plaza, we have all the names of the businesses on the back. And you will see ABC Beauty Supply. Now you notice that the roof is not purple. It's not purple because it's not part of the school. It's owned by the same person who owns the school, but they run it as a separate business. What could eventually make it part of the school? Well, if the school takes on a salon management program and decides to teach folk how to sell beauty supplies, it may then become incorporated into the school itself. And that stands for the premise that your Clery geography can change. We would also want to count that part of the parking lot that is designated for our students to park their cars, not necessarily the whole lot unless we have not been able to declare a certain parking section for our students, in which case we may have to count the whole thing. Those yellow lines that you see there constitute the idea of sidewalk, street, sidewalk, which is how we count public property that counts for Clery Act purposes. Sidewalk, street, sidewalk. Now we have a more traditional college campus. And while we see a lot more buildings, the concepts are essentially the same. All of the buildings with purple roofs are the buildings that the school owns and controls for educational purposes. The red ones are owned by the school, but controlled by somebody else. Now, here we might think of a building that's controlled by an alumni association or a foundation or the food court. Many traditional schools today have food courts, just like a mall might. And they invite in and allow folks to rent, to offer all of the food choices, drink choices, retail options for students and employees, all of the brand names, right? These days, very often colleges don't operate their own bookstores. And you know all of the names. Amazon, Barnes & Noble are often brought in. Sometimes some kind of a student co-op runs the bookstore. And the ownership of that group might be a little different than the institution itself. It's still part of the Clery geography. So all of those buildings, again, with purple and red roofs, Clery geography. Now, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, outside of that yellow public property boundary, you see Fraternity Row for our school. Those are buildings and properties that are owned and controlled by recognized student organizations. Most recognized student organizations don't actually own or control real property. If they have a meeting, they do it somewhere on campus. Maybe they have to sign up to use a particular room or some kind of a theater or something, but they typically don't have their own house. Greek organizations often do. Those are Clery geography as well. We call them non-campus properties. Sounds like something you wouldn't count, but you do. In that lower left-hand corner, you see a box with what looks like a blue diamond in it. Well, that's the athletic stadium. And like a lot of athletic stadiums operated by college campuses, it's not on the campus itself. It's a couple miles away. This is especially common for very large schools. There's simply no place to put an arena for 50,000 people. So it's a mile or two away from the campus. That too is called a non-campus property. And we have to count it as part of our Clery geography. We've talked about this idea of the yellow boundary, the sidewalk, street, sidewalk around the campus. It is part of our Clery geography, as is that dotted line on the outside that you see on this map. What's that dotted line? That's the patrol zone of our campus public safety office. Because typically a public safety office is going to have authority to patrol spaces beyond the campus. They'll usually set a perimeter. They work it out with local law enforcement. Jurisdictional rules are set up. Sometimes there's a so-called MOU, a memorandum of understanding between the local police and the campus public safety officials, sometimes known as an interagency agreement or mutual aid agreement, whatever you call it. There'll probably be some kind of agreement in place at your school that allows for public safety officials to patrol more than the campus itself. Clery geography. Now VAWA, because we're seeing a lot of violations in this space, unfortunately. And part of it is it's just the way VAWA has come along, right? Those regulations were added in 2015. But, since then, we've had some changes to Title IX for a variety of reasons. We've all lived through a global pandemic. And so some of these rules were a little slower to come online, but now we are actively enforcing them, and we're seeing violations that cause us great concern, and we don't want that to impact you. Very important that students and employees who are affected by sexual violence are given detailed information about their rights and options. We mentioned that earlier. We have added to our hate crime provisions through VAWA gender identity and perceived gender. These are newer categories. And apparently some institutions just haven't gotten the memo, because we continue to see schools that are not including that in their statistical grid. There has to be training provided for anybody who is so designated to investigate or adjudicate allegations of sexual violence. And we need to make sure that we have spelled out our procedures in our annual security report. Very often schools ask us, well, does the procedure on sexual misconduct that's in the annual security report have to be the institution's policy and procedures? And that always strikes us as a bit of an absurd question. The answer is, of course it does. But what you often find out is that some schools have multiple policies and procedures in this space. Maybe the rules differ for undergraduates versus graduate students. What about our employees versus faculty? Sometimes faculty have their own rules. Union employees who are under a collective bargaining agreement as opposed to non-unionized employees. So we may need to mention multiple disciplinary schemes to apply to different populations. The point is that the student or employee should be able to have solid information available to them about what they are likely to experience and expect throughout the case process. They shouldn't be surprised, right? And we need to emphasize that whatever the process, it has to be fair, prompt, and impartial. You have to list out all of the possible sanctions that could be imposed for violations of the sexual misconduct policy. Again, we emphasize various kinds of accommodations and protective measures that might be available and how to secure them. In that part about how to secure them, we want to think about different communities within our institution and what their needs might be. We think about the important role of disability services in making sure things are accessible, making sure that people don't have to tell the same difficult story multiple times, making sure that they have access to an advisor of their choice to assist them through the process, and making sure they are notified fully of outcomes reached and sanctions imposed. And if we're going to have appeals, making sure that both sides can participate in the appeals process. There's a lot that can go wrong there. There's so many schools, hundreds of them, that do it wonderfully, which proves it can be done well. But there are a number of schools who fall down on one or more of these provisions, and we need to make sure that we are meeting our marks again. We want to make sure that we are meeting the numerous requirements of the so-called Campus Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights. If you were to go to the regulations and you were to go to section B11, you would see all of these enumerated. We want to make sure that we are doing everything we can in the education space. Okay? We want to make sure we have those ongoing awareness and prevention programs, and that we are actively teaching folks about primary prevention, risk reduction, and bystander intervention. All of these are ways to protect people from sexual violence and to give them means of redress when those incidents do unfortunately occur. Now let's review. We have 5 areas that we highlighted in principle, right? If you want to have an idea of how we evaluate policies and procedures as the Department of Education, understand that we at the Clery Group apply a 3-pronged test, but it'll also help you with your other Title IV policies and procedures with things like admissions, refunds, satisfactory academic progress. First inquiry, did the school create a policy or procedure in a required area? Sometimes schools don't pass that. They simply don't have a timely warning policy. They don't have an emergency evacuation and response procedure. They don't have a refund policy. They don't have a policy on satisfactory academic progress. You see the interrelationship of these things. Second inquiry, if the school has a policy, does it fit within the parameters of the law? And 3, even if it fits in the parameters of the law, did they follow it? 3-prong test. Those of you who come from the financial aid community understand what the department's expectations are with policies and procedures, and you can be a great help, even in the Clery space, even though it's not your primary area of responsibility and probably should not be. Everybody wants to take and should take some responsibility for the safety and wellness of our students and employees. We talked about VAWA, which I almost think is a bonus category because it hasn't yet broken into the top 5. What did we talk about? Multiple reporting options, protecting rights and options and making sure folks understand them, including their rights to accommodations. Understand that intersection with Title IX of the civil rights requirements on sexual discrimination, and making sure that everything we do is accessible to all of our students and employees, that we're not missing any of our key groups, even if they're small groups on our campus, key groups, because we care about everybody in the community. Then we think about our campus security statistics. Let's make sure that we're classifying and counting incidents correctly. Let's also make sure that the data that we put in our annual security report matches the data we report to the Department of Education. That's an indication of administrative capability. Even if the numbers are wrong, they should certainly match. Unfortunately, too often they don't. Let's deduplicate, because we may have some students who don't report at all. We know that's a problem. In public safety generally, in society, people sometimes don't want to come forward and report crimes that they experience, and it actually undercuts our ability to stop those crimes in the future. But sometimes people report 2 or 3 different places, and that means we need to deduplicate. Understand that there's a very high bar to unfound crimes, so that if we receive a report, it's going to have to be part of our statistical disclosures unless we meet a very high standard for eliminating it from the data. And then understanding how to use the data for good. Once we've curated accurate and complete crime data, we should be using it to make those crimes less likely to occur in the future. Timely warning and emergency notification. We have to understand that concept of a significant or ongoing threat for timely warning. The emergency or dangerous condition standard for emergency notification. Okay? Now again, we could imagine a credible bomb threat in this space, a serious weather event, a chemical spill in a science lab, an outbreak of a communicable disease. It happens more often than you'd think, even when we're not in a pandemic situation. Then we want to make sure we're looking accurately for threats and taking the wide view. Okay? We want to look at risk on an all risk, all threat basis. And then we think about our campus security authorities. We have to identify them. Once we identify them, we have to notify them, and we have to make sure that we've given them a simplified way to report the information that's reported to them. Anytime we mention a school, the only reason we do it is so we can point to cases where you could go learn a principle. So we think back in this area of campus security authorities to the tragic case involving a doctor called Larry Nassar who had sexually assaulted students at a major university. Some of them were young children. In 1997, a young child, 11 years old, went to the head coach of that university's gymnastics team and said, "Dr. Larry sexually hurts me," and explained it in graphic detail. That person, who was a CSA, told that young person that if that is true, if that really happened to you, you should go report it to someone. Of course, she just had. And had that individual acted as she was required to act under the rules of almost everything, including humanity, perhaps that Dr. Larry Nassar could have been stopped in 1997. Instead, he was allowed to perpetrate crimes against individuals until 2016. This is where the Clery Act meets real life, right? This is not a paperwork requirement like we said at the beginning. This is about people and their wellness and their safety. In that vein, we want to make sure we're taking care of folks who aren't necessarily our students and employees. Increasingly, schools have a lot of young people on campuses for a variety of reasons. They're there for camps, for concerts, for other kinds of events. We need to know, at least in general terms, where the young people are, why they're there, how long they'll be there, who's supervising them, and when they're going to leave. The same is true for our visitor protection policy. We think of all the people who might come to an athletic event. We want to be open and accessible to the community in many cases. Some schools have decided that they can't for liability reasons. You have to decide that for yourselves. But whatever the situation is, we want to make sure we're taking care of others who may find themselves on our campus. That includes domestic partners of our students and employees, often forgotten in the public safety program. But because schools have so many kinds of diversified programs and academic options for folks and different kinds of schedules to take, increasingly people are bringing their spouses, their significant others, their children, sometimes other family members into our university, our college, our school community. And we want to make sure that we're accounting for their safety as well. In closing, I just want to thank you for taking the time to participate in this session. And I encourage you to always remember that the Clery Act, again, is about campus safety, crime protection, consumer protection, and wellness. And I hope you will go forward in that vein. And if we can ever help you, we want to do that always. Thank you so much.